The Senate chamber has seen its share of arguments, but what unfolded on that marble floor was unlike anything in living memory. It wasn't just a clash of personalities, it was a collision between generations, ideologies, and the very definition of who belongs in America's halls of power. One moment of rage, one unexpected response, and suddenly, the nation was forced to confront a question as old as democracy itself: who gets to have a voice, and who has the power to silence it? The Senate chamber had witnessed countless debates, but rarely anything as volatile as this. As the Freedom to Vote Act was introduced, tension filled the air, cameras hummed, pens scratched, and staffers exchanged uneasy glances. Senator Rand Paul sat rigid, eyes locked on Representative Jasmine Crockett, who had just begun her remarks. With calm precision, she argued that federal oversight of elections was not only constitutional but essential for democracy's survival. Paul's jaw tightened. To him, her very presence was a provocation. A freshman congresswoman, barely 2 years into her first term, she was commanding national attention, her speeches going viral and undermining his carefully cultivated authority. Weeks of private mockery and dismissal had done nothing to blunt her rising influence, and now, as she spoke with the poise of a seasoned litigator, he could feel the chamber's focus shifting away from him. Finally, his frustration boiled over, his hand slammed against the desk with a crack that silenced the hall. "You don't belong here," he shouted, shattering decorum and stunning the chamber into silence. The remark was more than an insult, it was an attempt to strip legitimacy from a sitting congresswoman before the nation. But Crockett did not flinch. Steady at the podium, she waited just long enough for the cameras to linger on Paul's flushed face before responding. "Senator Paul," she said firmly, "I appreciate your concern about constitutional law. Perhaps when I finish, you could explain to this chamber why you voted against the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act while claiming to support voting access." The jab landed hard, drawing gasps and murmurs across the floor. Paul bristled, refusing to answer, instead accusing her of grandstanding for cameras and chasing applause. Crockett, almost amused, tilted her head and replied evenly, "If defending the right of every American to cast a ballot without barriers is grandstanding, then I'll proudly wear that label. But I'm not here for likes or applause, I'm here because my constituents are counting on me to defend their voices." Her words cut with surgical precision, contrasting Paul's unrestrained anger with her unshakable composure. In that moment, the chamber understood, this was no longer just a debate on voting rights. It was a duel of authority, a battle waged with words sharp enough to wound, and for the first time, the veteran senator looked like he was on the defensive. The Senate chamber no longer felt like a hall of debate but a courtroom on trial, marble columns standing as silent jurors while cameras captured every breath. Rand Paul's fury still echoed, his hand frozen in accusation, but what looked like authority now resembled the tantrum of a prosecutor losing control. Jasmine Crockett, forged in the crucible of trial law, refused to meet rage with rage. Instead, she leaned toward the microphone, her calm a weapon in itself. "Senator," she said evenly, "you mentioned experience. So let's talk about it." One by one, she laid out his record: votes against election security, against restoring rights to citizens who had paid their debt to society, against protections for poll workers. Each fact landed like a gavel strike, exposing the hollowness of Paul's claim to constitutional purity. When he sputtered, accusing her of twisting context, she cut cleanly, "The context is clear. You defend liberty only for some, that's not constitutionalism. That's selective liberty." The chamber shifted, senators leaned in, reporters' pens raced. Paul was no longer the accuser, he was the defendant. And Crockett pressed on, elevating the fight to the Constitution itself. She invoked the 15th Amendment, the people's right to choose their representatives, and the preamble's promise to secure liberty and promote welfare. Then she turned his own attack back on him, her voice steady as marble, "You told me I don't belong here. But the Constitution, the very document you claim to revere, says otherwise. My people decided. So the question, Senator, is not whether I belong here, but whether you still do." The chamber gasped as the weight of her words settled like a verdict. Paul had come armed with anger. Crockett had come armed with the Constitution. And in that moment, it was clear which carried more power. The chamber whispers had already spilled into the world, but what followed made history. Cameras captured the clash, Rand Paul red-faced and jabbing the air, Jasmine Crockett calm and smiling, her words slicing with surgical precision. Within minutes, staffers were leaking clips, journalists firing off headlines, and by the time Crockett yielded the floor, the moment was viral. On Twitter, Paul's thunderous "You don't belong here" was instantly paired with Crockett's devastating reply, "The people sent me here. Maybe the real question is whether you belong here." The two-line exchange spread like wildfire, distilled into a meme that America couldn't stop replaying. Hashtags exploded, "You don't belong here" transformed into Crockett's rallying cry, echoed by women across industries sharing stories of exclusion and resilience. A split-image meme defined the night: Paul, red-faced under fragile power, and Crockett, composed under unshakable authority. By evening, cable news looped the exchange endlessly, analysts calling it a turning point. Crockett's following surged by hundreds of thousands, donations flooded in, her campaign website crashed, and speaking invitations poured through her inbox. Paul, meanwhile, reeled. Kentucky papers questioned his judgment, his mentions filled with ridicule, and even allies admitted privately he'd crossed a line. By the next morning, Capitol Hill hummed with the fallout. Democrats, once hesitant to elevate a freshman, now embraced Crockett as a rising national voice. Committee slots, interviews, fundraisers all opened overnight. Some compared her impact to Obama's breakout 2004 speech. Republicans, however, scrambled to contain the damage, frustrated that Paul had turned a policy debate into a personal catastrophe. His team's spin, that it was just a heated policy disagreement, collapsed under the undeniable footage, Paul shouting, Crockett smiling. Reporters cast it as a generational clash, old guard bluster versus new guard precision. Editorials argued it symbolized Washington's shifting power. Seniority no longer guaranteed dominance, but preparation and authenticity could. Behind the scenes, Crockett's staff revealed the truth. She had prepared meticulously, studying Paul's record, sharpening rebuttals, waiting for her moment. When it came, she was ready. The consequences stretched beyond reputation. Lawmakers began gravitating toward Crockett's arguments, reluctant to align themselves with Paul's outburst. Lobbyists requested meetings with her, sensing momentum. The message was clear: Jasmine Crockett was no longer just a freshman from Texas. She was a rising force. And Rand Paul's fury had been the spark that lit her fire. For Rand Paul, the gavel's fall marked not the end of a skirmish, but the beginning of a reckoning. His colleagues recoiled, senior Republicans muttering that he had become more liability than asset. Kentucky voters bristled at headlines questioning his judgment, their calls to his office focused not on policy but on his temper. The media replayed his outburst in endless loops, analyzing the tremor in his hands, the crack in his voice, an image of bluster undone by composure. Fundraising slowed, allies distanced themselves, and the aura of intimidation he once carried evaporated. For a man who had styled himself as Washington's disruptor, it was a brutal inversion. He had been disrupted, not by scandal or policy defeat, but by the calm precision of a freshman he tried to dismiss. For Jasmine Crockett, the same moment became the spark of ascent. Cable news heralded her as a rising star, headlines declaring she had redefined what it meant to belong in Washington. Online, her poised smile and sharp retort turned into memes, hashtags, and rallying cries, embraced by women and professionals far beyond politics. Donations flooded her campaign, websites crashed, and grassroots support surged from Americans who saw themselves in her defiance. Democratic leadership, quick to seize momentum, elevated her to high-profile committees and prime-time interviews. Outside Washington, she became a symbol of generational change, invited to commencements, praised by civil rights leaders, studied as an example of how to meet power with preparation, not fury. What Paul had intended as humiliation became the crucible that forged her national identity. In trying to declare she did not belong, he had instead helped crown her as one of the most compelling new voices in American politics. The Crockett-Paul confrontation did not fade like most political spats. It transformed into something larger, a story that slipped into the nation's bloodstream and reshaped how people thought about power and belonging. What began as a clash on the Senate floor became a cultural touchstone. In workplaces, Crockett's calm rebuttal was played in HR trainings as a lesson in resilience. In schools, it became a civics case study, law professors calling it a masterclass in cross-examination. In pop culture, it showed up on late-night comedy, in memes, and on T-shirts, with Crockett's steady smile paired with the words, "Do you belong here?" Grassroots organizers carried signs echoing the same phrase, flipping Paul's insult into a rallying cry of defiance, and yet, here I am. Months later, when the media frenzy subsided, the moment still lingered. For Jasmine Crockett, it became the cornerstone of her political rise, the proof of her credibility in the national arena. Analysts would later rank it beside Barack Obama's 2004 convention speech, a defining instant when a newcomer became a household name. For Rand Paul, it became a shadow that trailed him. Every opponent, every debate, every op-ed resurrected the clip as a cautionary tale, how arrogance, unchecked, can collapse under pressure. But beyond the politicians, the legacy was broader. Civics textbooks framed it as a modern parable of accountability, advocacy groups embraced it as a symbol of resistance, and ordinary people repeated it as a metaphor for their own struggles with exclusion. Its lesson was simple yet enduring. Belonging is not permission granted by the powerful, but the determination of those who refuse to be silenced. And so, when history remembers Jasmine Crockett's rise, it won't begin with her swearing-in or her first bill. It will begin with the moment she was told she didn't belong, and the way she proved, calmly and unequivocally, that she did.